Hello and welcome. If you've seen the I Fed Her to the Beast and the Beast is Me book review / summary, then you've probably recognized this outfit. I just did that earlier today, but this honestly might come out before it. This is going to be something a little different from what I usually do. If the background isn't any indication, I'm not doing a book review for this one. This video idea started as me kind of going over the books that I've kind of chosen to read this year, even though I'm not really quite sure when, and using that as a vehicle to talk about my journey with reading overall. So for practical purposes, this is a video essay. For realistic purposes, this is my personal yap session. I'm going to be covering, I have a lot of nonfiction reads, a lot of serious nonfiction reads this year. I hate the way this sounds out. Every time I start talking about this shit, I feel like Jade Smith.
Like, oh my God, like, can we talk about like the political and economic state of the world right now?
A lot of these books will be books that I'm planning to read this year, but not all of them. Some of these books will be books that I've read in past years, but altogether it's supposed to kind of give an idea of the ethos, the ideas that kind of lay the foundation behind me even releasing book reviews and writing all these and all that. And I mean, ultimately, this is kind of like a prototype of the final form of what this would eventually be, in the sense that the creation of these videos started because I wanted to improve the way that I could absorb, synthesize, and then communicate ideas that I feel like are important or are interesting. And I feel like I read a lot. I don't really watch movies. I don't watch as many TV shows either anymore. And so like I feel like there's so many interesting ideas in books, and a lot of times I just can't really talk about them with people. And so this channel was kind of like a easy way for someone to speed run the ideas of a book, and like the vibe of a book, maybe kind of get books that I think are good, a low bar of entry for people that are trying to get into reading, because I know a lot of people that want to read more, but they aren't really, they can't find that interest, that push to get through. And I feel like, you know, for movies and games and TV shows, it's so easy to get that feeling of like, oh, like I'll watch a playthrough and then maybe I'll play another game that's like this, or maybe I'll watch a summary of this movie or a trailer or something. There's no real thing like that for books. And so this was supposed to be like part of the idea, because this thing has many vehicles, but one of the main ideas behind this was as a gateway drug for people to engage with the worlds and ideas that I think are exciting, or that I just think should get a little more shine. But now that I've kind of said that piece, because that's kind of the idea behind this video, I do want to tell the story of how of me reading overall, because I think in recent years my actual journey through literature has meant a lot to me as far as the way I look at the world. I grew up in Ghana, from like the ages 1 to 11, in Ghana, West Africa, with my immediate nuclear family group. So my mom, my dad, my older sister, and then later on I had a younger sibling that came along, and blah 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 blah. But that's not the point of the story. So in this time we moved a lot, we were homeschooled, so like we had a very insular family unit. It was very much us. And so at some point when I was about like 9 or 10, my older sister flew from Ghana to the United States, California, and while she was there, I was basically alone at our house. I had a younger sibling, but 7 years different. They were an infant, basically a toddler, not much more than that. honestly, they annoyed the hell out of me at the time, because I was the former younger child, and many other reasons. But again, that's not the point of this. So I had so much free time, didn't go to school. So I just had like a lot of empty time after my older sister left, and so that's kind of how I got into reading. My mom had always put a huge emphasis on books throughout our whole lives, but I didn't really enjoy reading until I read Arthur the Invisible. She made me read Arthur the Invisibles. At the time, it looked huge. It was 500 pages, which was unthinkable at the time to me. But after I read it, like, that was the most exciting thing. Like, in hindsight, it's hilarious because it's like, we didn't have a TV or anything. We didn't have a computer. So it wasn't like I had these distractions. I probably read Arthur in the Invisibles and was like, holy shit, how could something even this amazing exist? You know, like, what a gateway into other worlds. Who could imagine a more higher elevated form of media than the book, you know? But all things considered, I think it was great because, I mean, of course I had watched TV and stuff before this, but nothing so high fantasy as Arthur and the Invisibles. So yeah, I opened up into fantasy pretty hard. I went into Animorphs. I read a book called Circles of Seven, which I think was a pretty later, like the last book in a large series. My entryway into reading thusly was very fantasy based and very entertainment based, and I followed this through all my reading years, through the John Flanagan to the James Patterson, to the Rick Riordan, to the Michael Grant. Shout out if you know who Michael Grant is with the Gone novels. Or Michael Carroll with the Superhuman. Oh my god, what do you call it? Quantum Prophecy. Oh my god, I'm really like reawakening parts of my brain of middle school. But yes, this was my main way of reading. So I went through all the Cassandra Clare romantasy vibes. I read through Throne of Glass before ACOTAR, and I read like the first 4 of ACOTAR before my adult brain fully formed, and I was like, what the fuck am I doing? But I say all this to say that I've wanted to try to get, or I've been encouraged to get into, as everyone has, nonfiction books, because, you know, they talk about life, and my parents have always tried to get me to get interested into it, and I just can't, bro. Following along with just some person, it never hit for me, because some people's real lives are very, very interesting. It's just, I would rather watch that. I never really wanted to read it, right? But this has changed for this year, and I think this change is one that has been slowly brewing for many years, and it's really just cultivated, or it's really peaked in this moment. I think this nonfiction itch started much earlier, in a seed planted. I feel like, you know, it would be so clean to explain this in a chronological order, but that's really just not how my brain experienced it. So before I talk about what kind of got me into actually reading nonfiction, let me tell you about a book that I wish that I had, but I cannot find. Freshman year of college, I was at Howard University, and I took this class called, I think, Afro-American Studies. And in it, we read this book called In the Wake on Blackness and Being. And this book was an incredible experience to go through. It was written by this lady named Christina Sharp, and her approach was so fascinating to me because it mixed facts with history, with poetry, as a way of looking at humanity in a complete form. You know, I feel like it's so interesting because literature, art itself, is kind of how we preserve the soul of humanity. But a lot of times we excise it a lot from the way that we judge humans. This book was incredible because it had a way of creating a complete picture in a way that I connected with, because it wasn't just historical, it wasn't just factual, but it contained within it a etymological and a metaphorical analysis, that and a poetic analysis that filled out what an examination of humanity should look or would look like for me. One example of this is in the title of it being called In the Wake. It's a discussion because the book opens up with what awake means for Black people throughout its multiple meanings. One being the trail left behind of a ship, which is referenced in, how African Americans were transported to the Americas and other places. It refers to the vigil that you hold for when someone is passing, and the relationship between Black people and death that has existed since the transatlantic slave trade, as it pertains to all the risks to Black life. This all eventually leads to an argument surrounding the fact that the biggest risk to Black life is a lack of care, and that is care in multiple senses as it relates to the actual care for Black life, or people caring for Black people. And buried in this argument, even deeper, is a discussion of what are the aspects of humanity that, not in concept but in practice, bestow rights upon a person. And then you look at what actually indexes humanity as far as what our social systems and political systems view as human. Because if you really look at the battle of civil rights, what it really is the struggle for various groups of people to achieve the status of full human. And the marker that has existed for what that full human looks like is a white land-owning male. And so you have that as the prototype of man, and then everybody kind of falls in stratification in rights depending on how close to that idea you can reach. The ideas in this book will pop up again here, which is why I explained it. But anyway, encountered that in freshman year of college. And then you fast forward to 2022, I read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. I actually had the opportunity to read Octavia Butler back when I was in high school, because I had a incredible teacher that fought to create his own curriculum and he put Kindred on there. And me being the dingus I am, was probably reading like Crown of Midnight or some shit. And I chose not to read Kindred because I just wasn't interested at the time. It's one of the things that I'm just like, bro, you're such an idiot, because I wish I had encountered Octavia Butler back then, because she's literally one of my favorite authors to this day. But 2022 is when I first read Parable of the Sower. I may have read Wild Seed before that, but I read Parable of the Sower, and Parable of the Sower is a book that absolutely changed the way that I looked at the world, at the way I looked at literature, the way I looked at fantasy. It just changed everything for me, and I'm not gonna get into it. I actually, my senior paper to graduate, my senior project was surrounded around parable of the sower, but a central idea of the parable of the sower. So actually, speaking of parable of the sower, a friend of mine got me this gift. It's a book called A Few Rules for Predicting the Future, and it's by Octavia Butler, or it's a compilation of different things that she said, right? And I wanted to read the beginning of it because I think it really just encapsulates what it is that parable of the sower gave to me. Octavia is somewhere talking, and some student asked her this question, and then she answered. So I'm just gonna cover the. It's gonna be very Socratic. I'm gonna show the exchange, or enough of it. So, do you really believe that in the future we're gonna have the kind of trouble that you write about in your books? A student asked me as I was signing books after a talk. The young man was referring to the troubles I described in the parable of the sower and the parable of the talents. Novels that take place in a near future of increasing drug addiction and illiteracy, marked by the popularity of prisons and the unpopularity of public schools, the vast and growing gap between the rich and everyone else, and the whole nasty family of problems brought on by global warming. I didn't make up the problems, I pointed out. All I did was look around at the problems we're neglecting now and give them 30 years to grow into full-fledged disasters. Okay, the young man challenged. So what's the answer? There isn't one, I told him. No answer? You mean we're just doomed? He smiled as though he thought this might be a joke. No, I said. I mean there's no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers, at least. You can be one of them if you choose to be. So yes, it was this moment for me and reading Parable of the Sower that fantasy and reality really crashed into each other in a way that was irreversible for me. Because obviously I've read dystopian novels, Ray Bradbury, this, that, but this was... Parable of the Sower is, I used to live in California, so Parable of the Sower is a book where, I literally could feel that novel, every chapter, all the questions posed on it, and feel that desperation for an answer that Lauren has. And it made me hungry for real answers that this fantasy had grown within me. And it's also this moment that I kind of really got more into D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. I got a little interested back when I was in college, but it's a lot of work. I'm not going to get into it, but it was during this time that I really began to double down on what I believe the worth of imagination to be, and how I think that a lot of times we're trained to use our imagination to imagine the worst. And while that is useful at times, I think we forget that we can use our imagination to try and imagine a world that isn't the way it is, that things don't have to be this way, Imagination is literally the roadway out of it, it's the imagination is the only way you see beyond what you have right in front of you. And I think Black imagination is so important because it is something that has been critical to us reaching that next stage, that next achievement of humanity for ourselves, is imagining that for ourselves, imagining what that could be for us. And again, all this imagining stuff will be tied into the books that I bring up later on. So this is what Parable of the Sower kind of did for me. It was something that struck me on a practical level, creative level, an imaginative level, and it made me aspire to bring movement to the stuff that I write, something deeper than story structure and pretty things, and to look at the way that the world talks to me a little differently. And so this blah 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 blah. I read N.K. Jemisin. I'm reading R.F. Kuang. I'm reading. These are all kind of like breadcrumbs all onto this book that I read last year, Will to Change by Bell Hooks. And I one or two people might be giggling because if you've been around me in recent months, you've probably heard me talk about this book quite a lot. I honestly can't recommend it enough to anybody because it's written for men, but it's kind of written for everyone, which is kind of the point once you start to read it, because returning back to Christina Sharp's interrogation of blackness and that being an interrogation of humanity, this interrogates man and woman and the indexes of humanity that we attribute to each. What led me to reading The Will to Change is because in the past 4 years, I became very interested in the manosphere. Interested in how the illogics of it could just like function on itself and feed itself. How a lot of it is men telling men that they will teach them how to be better men, and they do it by denigrating them. I've always been fascinated with cults, with all these groups that are able to cultivate a cognitive dissonance in their followers that produces profit for them, and just figure out what that is, because I'm a man, so it's like I feel it marketed to me, but it never hit me. And as it never hitting me, I never really realized how big of an issue it is. So yeah, I started thinking like, what resources are there out there for men to understand how to be a man, how to be a good man, how to be a man with a sense of self-worth, like all those good things. And like I work at a bookstore, so I would go through the gender studies section and stuff, and a lot of manhood instruction just seemed like very little of it seemed to do with building any sense of personal self-worth. A lot of it just seemed to do with showing you how to earn approval from society as a man. And it was just like, as someone who had gone through a lot of college at this point, just watching a lot. I also tend to be the therapy friend. So, I hear a lot of dudes talk about their problems in a way where they're like, wow, man, you're really insightful. You really listen. And it's just like, bro, like, you just need to allow that side of yourself to exist. Even considering rape culture on college campuses and what that stems from, like just trying to figure out why men are so fucked up, like as a man myself, it's weird to like constantly hear about yourself in that way where it's just like, it can't be that we're just naturally supposed to be this fucked up to everything, and even we're fucked up in our relationships with each other, and we regret that, but we can't stop it. And this pertains to a lot of areas of the way that people contend with each other, but these were like the central issues that I had at the time. And The Will to Change really helped me break down the ideas of sex and gender and the way that we attach certain connotations to them and then mix and match them. It's a much deeper conversation than just sex or gender, so I don't really want to get too deep into it, but it's really a conversation again about the human and how the ideas of sex and gender compartmentalize that for the benefit of various systems that we live under. And so the will to change really helped me understand why men empowerment movements and groups and stuff to me had always seemed so exploitative and a lot of times so vapid without actual substance under there to actually show what pursuing a life of value, means. So anyway, so the will to change happens. The will to change is what I see as the ground zero event of me then needing to read nonfiction, because for me, because of the way it broke down the systems of capitalism, of patriarchy, of racism, of the way that all of these are tied to the idea of the human and what we count as human, it brought that to the forefront. And because it sat at the root of so much, it just made me need to connect a lot more real life processes and structures to the fantasy elements that I read so much about, So now I kind of want to just tell you about what that means for me, because what that means for me are all the nonfiction books that I bought. And I don't know if I'm going to read all of these. I've already read one. It is the hardest book that I've read in years since college, and I had to do it all by myself. But I actually like the fact that I got through it. I was like, wow, I did it. And I definitely have to go through it more times. But let's just go through it, right? So the first book I read this year is called Black on Both Sides, a Racial History of Trans Identity. And part of the reason why I wanted to read this book is because first, learning how much money was spent on those anti-trans ads and lobbying and rhetoric last year, it was just astonishing, because it's kind of like watching. Also, a big part of the reason why I'm so interested in this idea of the human is because a lot of the fiction and the fantasy I read they tackle the idea of how people create monsters and why we create monsters and what we do with those monsters, how we benefit from them, etc., etc., etc. And I think the discussion around trans people during the last election was just a very glaring example of how they were constructed to be these monsters that had such a heavy bearing on an election, when it's like, in truth, what does this affect about your life? When it comes to the economy, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to like actually living day to day, this became such a talking point because they were able to create a boogeyman and then benefit off of that. And so I was really interested in this book for a number of reasons, that being chief among them. Another is because I think that there is or at least as I have experienced, there's a lot of divisive talk as it pertains to Black culture and trans culture that I think is very pervasive and very counterintuitive. I think that a lot of times there's this huge idea of gay people being outside of Black culture, and so a lot of Black people will talk about trans issues as if it's a separate thing from Blackness, like Black people aren't trans. And of course, this is tied to larger societal issues. Of course, this is a microcosm in this community, but as it pertains to me, I'm Black, and so not only is it a misconception, but like it places these Black trans people in this space where a lot of times they can't even be seen in their already marginalized position in society. And this book wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I thought this one I thought this book would be a little more like A to B, straightforward. Like, here are the story of some trans people, some black trans people throughout the years, this that you don't really know about, you haven't really heard about, which it does include, but much deeper than that. It ties back to the discussion of what the human is that was being had in The Will to Change, but it takes it deeper. And it talks about the way that black bodies were sexless as we were brought over in chattel slavery, because we were property, and property doesn't have sex or gender. And so it really talks about the constructions of sex and gender and the history as it pertains directly to black people, but it really talks about humanity in general. And the book gets very, very esoteric. It gets very, very figurative at times, but a very significant point that it also brings up is that a lot of these stories exist in negation, because these are literally narratives that attempted to be covered up or whitewashed or misinterpreted. And so even in reading a lot of these lives and bringing justice to their voices, you have to read it through the lines of the occupying force that dictated their humanity. And a big example that the book opens up is the discussion of the quote-unquote father of gynecology, something Sims. His last name is Sims. And I started reading, because I got this itch for nonfiction a couple years ago. I started reading Stamped from the Beginning, the Ibram X. Kendi book. Never finished it. I do need to finish it, but he also mentions this Sims dude. Super nasty dude, but he's also someone that is very much respected, and his journals were instrumental in developing gynecology that he developed by experimenting on black women slaves, and a lot of times without anesthesia. Lots of horrific shit. It was very, very hard to get through that portion of the book. But what it really talks about is the way that the black women slaves were treated as opposed to the white women patients, and the way that this idea of like chastity, because the white women patients, they were not buck ass while they're getting these gynecology things down. They basically would just like open up like a tiny little square of flap, and then everything else is covered. You can't even see her body. And so like there is an over purification of the quote unquote woman created, and then there is a robbery of humanity to the black woman that then becomes sexless, that you can view upon her flesh without that chastity. Don't have to keep getting deeper into it. It's an incredible book. I can't recommend it enough. But this book, this is one of many that I hope to get deeper into. But before I continue on all these black ass books that I'm reading this year, I want to quickly mention this book that I read right after Black on Both Sides, and that is The Phantom Toll Booth by Norton Juster. I read this book because I be doing music reviews sometimes, and I'm doing one for the Tyler the Creative album Chromacopia, hopefully eventually, and his character was a reference to a character in here. So I was like, hey, it's a mid-grade book, I'll just read it. But in the process of reading it, it really brought me back to, because it's a book all about imagination and appreciating the world around you. There were some things that I do have some questions about, but I mean, that's just classic literature for you. But it's a really, really beautiful novel about the power of imagination and really appreciating the world around you. And I thought it was just a beautiful book to read during this time while I'm kind of meditating on the power of imagination. But let's go through some of these books that I plan on reading this year. James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. I should have read this many years ago. Look how tiny it is. I really am just interested in reading works by authors that I've always thought were really, really great thinkers, and that would give me a little more clue into their experience of humanity, because they were people that would think about it in, critical ways. James Baldwin being one of them. I've heard some of his speeches, I've read some of his essays, never read a full book, like a book about him. So I'm really excited to read his autobiography and learn a little bit more about him. Another reason is because he was really connected to the church, and so was Octavia Butler. And I've always had an interesting relationship to the church and Christianity, being that I didn't grow up Christian, but a lot of African American societal structure and community structure is based in religion and Christianity, and there's a very love-hate relationship there, because Black people were given things like the slave Bible, in order to domesticate us, but also churches were like instrumental in things like the Underground Railroad, and they're still instrumental in giving Black people opportunities, but they can also be very exploitative, and have been. So I've had a lot of feelings, and even though I think the church Christianity is a lot of things, ultimately I feel like religion and spirituality are different paths to a central truth, and I'm really just trying to find the central truth. And so, being that so much of the Western world with which I exist in, and with which much of the modern world is constructed around, is based within Christian thought, I think that, and a lot of the deep thinkers that I follow grew up with Christianity as the basis for their thought and extrapolated a lot of great ideas and concepts from there. I do want to eventually read the entire Bible, but I also want to just kind of explore Black Christianity and Christianity more in general. And so The Fire Next Time is a tie to that. Something else that is a tie to that is this book I got called The Black Utopians. Searching for Paradise in the Promised Land in America. Essentially about a Christian group in somewhere in America, I don't remember where, and their attempt to create a community that was self-sustaining, that took care of a lot of Black life. And I'm very interested in this because of it being a Christian community, so I want to see kind of like how that vision of it built out for them, and relating back to the ideas of Black imagination of life, of futures of what life could be, and the way that you would potentially attempt to translate that into the real world, And so that is my interest in The Black Utopians. We'll see if I read it this year, because it's so hard to stay the course. But back to that, but staying on that Christianity point for a little longer, I also plan to read the Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. I started it a little. I will continue going through it, but it's one of those things where, for one, it's way more interesting to me on just an entry level than the straight up Bible is. So it's a way for me to get into a lot of modern conceptions around Christianity without just jumping straight into the Bible, because I don't feel ready for that right now. I don't think I'm gonna get through it. And so I want to explore the dramatic language of this poetry as well as part of the fun. I watched Denzel's Macbeth, and I just love the way they spoke in that. But anyway, so I'm trying to get into the Divine Comedy. I read Milton's Paradise Lost, or at least half of it, for school 5 years ago, and it's just very interesting seeing how certain ideas become like mainstream. You would think they were straight out of the Bible. Just to stay on that Christian point, I also got this book called Black Liturgies: Prayers, Poems, and Meditations for Staying Human. This book is kind of an encapsulation of that idea of Christianity being a vehicle to a central truth. This is someone who kind of came up out of Christian culture, but isn't necessarily Christian, but they still speak through it a lot. These are different prayers and meditations and stuff that are good for remembering your humanity, tying back to that whole idea about art being the thing that retains the soul of humanity. I think people should connect more with literature for those reasons as well. And I think there's just a lot of things that I read this, or every other night or so I'll read another page or so and have just the meditations be the last thing that I think about when I go to bed. And it's a way to think about spirituality as it pertains to Christianity, and transcends as well, reaches further, you know? Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle. I mean, I think this one's just kind of self-explanatory. Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. I've never read a nature book. When I was younger, I used to read some that would be like nature books about insects and animals and things like that. This is the first one that is gonna be like a slow meditation on nature. And part of this is me wanting to kind of connect back into the patterns of nature. Like, if you really think about science and poetry, it's all really slowing down and studying the patterns and minutia of nature to understand it deeper. And I think that it's kind of hard to remember to do that today, especially with so many things that are willing distractions. And so I really just wanted this book to kind of make me connect with that part of myself and see if anything deeper might arise from that, you know? So that's why that's there. Hanif Abdurraqib's They Can't Kill Us Till They Kill Us. I've seen this dude's name pop up over and over the years as I've worked at my bookstore, and being a fiction reader, I just never really locked in. But these are essays, and they are just he's a dude from hip hop, and they pertain to figures from hip hop like Schoolboy Q and stuff, and they're meditations about Black life as it pertains to media and other things. And so if you know me, you know I love hip hop, you know I love Black culture, and so I am very curious as to what these meditations sound like, what these essays are about and what they say, and how they interact with how I see the world. And I have a number of potential other ones, but I don't think I want to name them because they might fall in and out. There's also the chance that I don't read a lot of these, in which case I misled a lot of you, and I'm sorry for that. It's been a very interesting time reading all this nonfiction lately, and just sitting with watching how the world is developing, because all this meditation around manhood, right, and this idea of what the man is, and if you connect that to economics and you think about capitalism and what runs capitalism, and how men are essentially the fuel that run the machines of capitalism, and therefore men are producers. And if you really look at a lot of this man instruction media, it attacks the part of men that feel like they're supposed to be producing. And the way that they suggest that you alleviate this is by, one, paying them for their program, and two, denigrating women, making sure that they submit and everything because that's how you feel better. And it's a way to make you produce for larger systems that don't really enrich you, but make you feel like you're doing quote unquote work and that gives you the right to dominion over women, or others just in general, because it's just much deeper than sex or gender. But looking at the world today as it pertains to gambling, right? Another book that I'm going to be reading is Dopamine Nation. I just don't know when I'm going to get to it, so I didn't mention it. But the new epidemic of online gambling, right? And all these streamers and stuff. If you, I kind of, you know what? I'm going to get to that later. Just know that the construction of man goes much deeper for me, and it's tied to Drake to me. It's tied to online betting sites. It's tied to CS:GO. It's tied to cryptocurrency and Sam Bankman-Fried and fucking Elon Musk and shit. Like, just looking at the structure, everything, it just feels like I have to understand what the fuck is going on, you know? And so nonfiction is my jam right now, you know? Coming to the end of this video, it's kind of funny. I think I'm probably hitting like 2 hours. The end of this video is really, I'm reading a lot of nonfiction right now because there's nothing stranger than what's going on right now. And I need to understand. And so if you have any ideas, any responses, if you want to talk about any of these books, hit me up, you know. I'm just thinking, you know. And so we'll see if this ever comes out too. But peace, you know. This is one of those videos that like maybe one person will watch 4 minutes of it and then click off. I think this is more for me to remember the way I was thinking around this time, you know. Anyway, peace.